My 6-year-old adopted granddaughter was left at home alone while my son and his wife took their biological son on a 15-day Caribbean cruise. She called me at 1:30 in the morning, crying, asking why they did not wake her up. I booked last-minute tickets, and within 7 hours, we crashed their luxury vacation. My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired chief engineer, and a man who spent his entire life building a secure future for his family. Before I tell you how I ended up completely dismantling my own son's life, please tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that protecting a child is more important than protecting a blood relative. It was exactly 1:30 in the morning on a Tuesday when the phone on my nightstand started ringing. At 70 years old, a phone call in the middle of the night never brings good news. You wake up with your heart already hammering against your ribs, your mind racing through a terrible list of the people you love. I fumbled in the dark, my hand knocking over a glass of water before I finally grabbed the receiver. I expected a hospital. I expected the police. What I got was a tiny trembling voice that shattered my world into a million pieces. Grandpa. It was Maya, my 6-year-old adopted granddaughter. Her voice was barely a whisper choked with thick, heavy sobs that told me she had been crying for a long time before she finally found the courage to dial my number. Maya, sweetheart. What is wrong? Where are your parents? I asked, sitting straight up in bed, the sleep instantly vanishing from my brain. Grandpa, why did not they wake me up? It is dark and I am hungry. The words did not make sense at first. I asked her to calm down and tell me where Derek and Stephanie were. Derek is my 36-year-old son, the vice president of a media company, and Stephanie is his wife, a 34-year-old woman who makes her living posting about her perfect family lifestyle on the internet. 2 years ago, they adopted Maya. To the outside world and to their thousands of followers, Maya was their beautiful blessing. They paraded her on social media, writing long posts about love and charity. But right now, at 1:30 in the morning, their perfect blessing was sobbing alone in the dark. I am in my room, Maya cried. The door is locked from the outside. I cannot get out. Hunter is gone too. Everyone is gone. Do not move, Maya. Grandpa is coming right now. Stay on the phone with me. I did not bother changing out of my sweatpants. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and a heavy flashlight from the drawer, my mind spinning with a cold, terrifying dread. I left the phone on speaker, listening to the sound of her ragged breathing as I started my truck and backed out of the driveway. The drive to their upscale suburban Seattle home usually takes 20 minutes. I made it in 10, ignoring red lights and speed limits, gripped by a primal panic. How does a 6-year-old child wake up locked in her room in an empty house? Where was the babysitter? Where was my son? I pulled up to their massive 2-story house. The driveway was empty. Derek's SUV was gone. Stephanie's luxury sedan was gone. Every single light in the house was turned off, making the large structure look like a black void against the night sky. I ran up to the front door and tried the handle. Locked. I pounded my fist against the heavy wood, shouting Derek's name, hoping against hope that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding, that maybe they were deep asleep inside. Nothing. Absolute dead silence. I did not wait another second. I ran to the back of the house, grabbed a heavy landscaping rock from the garden, and smashed it straight through the glass panel of the back door. I reached in, ignoring the sharp shards cutting into my forearm, and unlocked the deadbolt. Derek! Stephanie! I roared as I stepped into the dark kitchen, sweeping my flashlight across the room. The house was spotless, perfectly clean, and entirely abandoned. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my knees aching, my chest heaving with every step. I ran straight to Maya's bedroom at the end of the hallway. Just as she had told me, the door was shut, and the heavy exterior latch was locked from the outside. Who installs a lock on the outside of a child's bedroom door? My blood ran cold as I flipped the latch and pushed the door open. Maya was huddled in the corner of her bed, clutching her knees to her chest, her small face stained with tears and terror. When the flashlight beam hit her, she let out a whimpering cry and scrambled across the mattress, throwing her little arms around my neck. I dropped the flashlight and held her tight, feeling her heart beating like a trapped bird against my chest. "I have got you, sweetheart. You are safe. Grandpa is here," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light in the room, I looked around. What I saw made the anger rise in my throat hot and bitter. On her small nightstand, placed just within her reach, was a single plastic bottle of water and 2 packets of dry crackers. That was it. That was the extent of their care. They had left her locked in a cage like an animal with rations. I carried her out of the room, my protective instinct shifting into pure, unadulterated rage. I walked down the hall to the master bedroom and pushed the door open. The closet doors were wide open. Half the hangers were empty. The large suitcases that usually sat on the top shelf were gone. I walked over to 8-year-old Hunter's room. His bed was perfectly made, his closet equally rated for a trip. They had packed. They had taken their biological son, and they had left their adopted daughter locked in a dark room with a bottle of water. I brought Maya down to the kitchen, sitting her on the counter while I turned on the lights. The bright illumination revealed a house that had been methodically prepared for a long absence. The trash cans were empty. The perishable food had been cleared from the refrigerator. And there, sitting right in the middle of the expensive granite island that I had helped them pay for, was a small, casual, yellow sticky note. I picked it up, and my hands shaking not from fear, but from a fury I had never experienced in my 70 years of life. The note was written in Stephanie's neat, looping handwriting. It read, "Left $100. Just drop off food once a day. Do not let her out to mess up the house." I stared at that piece of paper, reading the words over and over again until they burned into my brain. Drop off food once a day. Do not let her out. They had not forgotten her. This was not a tragic accident or a miscommunication with a professional babysitter. This was a calculated, deliberate act of abandonment. They had treated a human being, my granddaughter, like a dog that needed to be fed over the fence. Who was this note for? Who was supposed to come and drop off the food? I looked around the pristine kitchen, realizing that the people I thought I knew, the son I had raised to be an honorable man, had committed an act of unspeakable cruelty. I spent 40 years as a chief engineer building structures meant to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. I spent my entire life building a secure foundation for my family, ensuring that my son would never know a day of hunger or fear. My late wife and I poured every ounce of our love into raising Derek to be a protector, to be a good man. To see the culmination of all those years of effort reduced to a child shivering in a locked room felt like a physical blow to my chest. It felt like every value we tried to instill in him had been completely erased by a woman who only cared about her social media aesthetic. As I buckled Maya into the passenger seat of my truck, wrapping my warm coat around her trembling shoulders, she looked up at me with eyes so full of innocent confusion, it nearly broke me. "Grandpa, did I do something bad? Did they leave because I was bad?" I stopped completely, the cold Seattle wind biting at my face. I leaned in, cupping her cold cheeks in my hands. "No, my sweet girl," I told her, my voice hard with a promise. "You are perfect. They are the ones who are broken, and I am going to make sure they know it." I walked away from that house, leaving the front door wide open. I was not just going to take her home. I was going to find out exactly where they went, and then I was going to tear their perfect fake world to the ground. I carried her into the kitchen, my heavy boots crunching faintly against the hardwood floor. The silence in the house was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I reached out and flipped the light switch. The recessed lighting flooded the room, revealing a space that had been meticulously sterilized. This was not a family rushing out the door for a last-minute emergency. The countertops were wiped completely clean. The sink was spotless. The dishwasher was empty and open. They had taken the time to scrub their kitchen while leaving a child locked upstairs. I set Maya down gently on one of the tall leather bar stools. She pulled her knees back up to her chest, her small hands gripping the edges of my oversized coat. Her eyes darted around the bright room, blinking against the harsh light. I walked over to the massive granite island, the very same island I had transferred $5,000 from my savings to help them upgrade just last year. Right in the dead center of that pristine stone surface, sitting under the glow of the pendant lights, was a small, bright yellow sticky note. Beside the note lay a single crisp $100 bill. I picked up the small square of paper. My fingers were trembling, but the tremor was entirely born of a dark, boiling rage. The note was written in Stephanie's neat, looping handwriting, the same careful script she used to write fake, loving captions for her thousands of followers. I read the words and the air physically left my lungs. The note simply said, "Left $100. Just drop off food once a day. Do not let her out to mess up the house." I stared at that piece of paper, reading the cruel instruction over and over again, until the ink seemed to burn directly into my vision. Drop off food once a day. Do not let her out. The sheer calculated callousness of those words was unfathomable. They had not forgotten her in a panic. This was a deliberate, planned act of abandonment. They had treated a 6-year-old human being, my granddaughter, like an unwanted animal that merely needed to be fed over a fence. I crushed the note in my fist, my knuckles turning white. Who was this note even meant for? Who was supposed to walk into this empty house, take this pitiful sum of money, and drop food through a cracked door? I looked around the silent kitchen, realizing that the people I thought I knew, the son I had raised to be an honorable man, had committed an act of unspeakable cruelty. I spent my entire life building a secure foundation for my family. My late wife and I poured every ounce of our love into raising Derek to be a protector, to be a truly good man. To see the culmination of all those years of parental effort reduced to a child shivering on a bar stool felt like a dagger to the heart. It felt like every value we tried to instill in him had been completely erased by a woman who only cared about her social media aesthetic, and he had eagerly played along. I forced myself to take a deep, steadying breath. I could not let Maya see the violent extent of my anger. She needed a grandfather right now, not a judge. I turned my attention back to her. "Are you hungry, sweetie?" I asked, forcing a gentle tone into my voice. She nodded slowly, her big brown eyes wide and fearful. I walked over to the massive stainless steel refrigerator and pulled open the double doors. The cold air spilled out, revealing empty shelves. They had cleared out all the perishable food. There was no milk, no fresh fruit, no bread. Only a few bottles of sparkling water and some expensive condiments sat in the door racks. The thoroughness of their preparation was sickening. They made absolutely sure nothing would spoil while they were gone. I opened the pantry doors next. Thankfully, the dry goods were still there. I found a box of macaroni and cheese, a can of tomato soup, and a plastic container of applesauce. It was not a gourmet meal, but it was warm and filling. I grabbed a pot from the lower cabinet, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. The sound of the running water and the clicking of the gas burner seemed to ground me. It gave my shaking hands a necessary task, a simple rhythm to keep the rage at bay. I stood by the stove, stirring the pasta, occasionally glancing over my shoulder at Maya. She was watching me intently, her small shoulders still trembling slightly beneath my coat. I poured the warm soup into a ceramic bowl and scooped the hot macaroni onto a small plate. I carried the food over to the island and set it gently in front of her. I pulled up a stool beside her and watched as she picked up the spoon. Her hand was shaking so much that the metal clattered against the sides of the bowl. She ate with a desperate urgency that made my stomach physically churn. She devoured the food, practically inhaling the warm pasta. I sat there, in the quiet, sterilized kitchen, listening to the small sounds of her eating. Every bite she took was a direct indictment against my son. Every fearful glance she cast toward the dark hallway was a testament to the emotional abuse she had endured in this house. As she finished the very last bite, a cold, calculated strategy began to form in my mind. I would not just take her home and simply wait for them to return. I was going to find out exactly where they went. I would track down their luxury escape, and then I would absolutely make sure they paid a very high price for this ultimate betrayal of our family. The drive back to my house was a blur of calculated silence. I kept the heater running high, the steady hum filling the space between us. Maya had fallen back asleep against the passenger door, her small hands still clutching the edges of my heavy coat. Every time we passed beneath a street lamp, the orange light washed over her pale, tear-stained face. I drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles stark white. My mind kept returning to that bright, sterile kitchen and the yellow sticky note resting perfectly in the center of the granite island. Left $100. Just drop off food once a day. Do not let her out to mess up the house. The sheer depravity of those words echoed in my head, competing with the rhythmic thump of my tires against the pavement. $100. That was the value they had placed on her life for 2 entire weeks. A single crisp bill left on a counter, as if they were paying someone to water a collection of houseplants. They had not panicked. They had not made a desperate last-minute mistake due to a sudden illness. They had planned this. They had calculated the absolute minimum amount of effort required to keep a 6-year-old child breathing while they drank champagne on a luxury cruise liner. The $50 insult, if you divided it by the 2 weeks, was a profound statement of their cruelty. Actually, it was less than $10 a day. The math was sickening. I turned down my quiet, tree-lined street and pulled into my driveway. The familiar sight of my single-story brick house, the home where my late wife and I had raised Derek, offered a brief moment of comfort. I turned off the engine and carefully unbuckled Maya. She stirred but did not wake as I lifted her into my arms. She was so incredibly light. I carried her up the front steps, unlocked the door, and stepped into the warm, familiar hallway of my home. I took her straight to the guest bedroom, a room she had always called her own during weekend visits. I laid her down gently on the soft quilt and pulled the thick comforter up to her chin. She curled into a small ball, instinctively trying to make herself invisible. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. The rage inside me was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs, demanding to be let out. I wanted to smash my fist through the drywall. I wanted to tear down the shelves, but I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. I had to remain composed. Maya needed absolute stability. I quietly pulled the door shut, leaving it open just a crack so the light from the hallway would seep in, chasing away the dark. Then I walked into my own kitchen. It was 4 a.m, but my body felt completely electrified. Adrenaline pumped through my veins, sharp and cold. I walked over to the refrigerator and began pulling out ingredients. Eggs, butter, a loaf of fresh sourdough bread, a carton of whole milk. The crackers and bottled water they had left her were a cruel mockery of sustenance. I was going to make her a real nourishing meal. I cracked 3 eggs into a glass bowl, the sharp snap of the shells breaking the heavy silence of the house. I beat them methodically with a wire whisk, watching the yolks blend into a smooth, pale yellow. The repetitive, simple motion helped anchor my racing thoughts. I placed a heavy iron skillet on the stove and turned on the gas burner, watching the blue flame flare to life. I dropped a generous pat of butter into the pan, listening to it sizzle and melt. As the butter browned, my thoughts drifted back to Stephanie. I thought about the thousands of people who followed her online, reading her long poetic posts about the challenges and profound joys of adopting a child. I thought about the professional photographs she posted, showing her hugging Maya, holding her hand, styling her hair. It was an elaborate, highly profitable performance. Behind the filter, she was a woman who could lock a little girl in a dark room and leave for the Caribbean without a single ounce of remorse. And Derek, my own flesh and blood, had stood right beside her, packed his bags, and walked out the door. He was just as guilty. He had traded his soul for an easier vacation. I poured the beaten eggs into the hot skillet, the sizzling sound filling the kitchen. I moved the spatula with slow, deliberate strokes, folding the eggs perfectly. I placed 2 slices of sourdough into the toaster. I wanted the smell of real food, of warmth and safety, to be the very first thing Maya noticed when she woke up. I wanted to replace the sterile, terrifying emptiness of that other house with the comforting reality of my home. I plated the soft, steaming eggs and the golden buttered toast. I poured a tall glass of cold milk. I set everything on a wooden tray and carried it down the hallway. Just as I reached the bedroom door, I heard a soft, rustling sound. Maya was sitting up in bed, rubbing her swollen eyes. When she saw me, her shoulders instantly dropped, releasing a tension she had been holding for hours. "Grandpa," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. I smiled, forcing every trace of anger from my expression. "I brought you some breakfast, sweetheart," I said, setting the tray carefully on her lap. "Real breakfast, not crackers." She looked down at the warm food, and for the first time since I broke through that glass door, a tiny hesitant smile touched the corners of her mouth. She picked up the fork and took a bite of the eggs. I sat on the edge of the mattress, watching her eat, feeling a fierce, unbreakable resolve solidify in my chest. I gently stroked her hair, letting the quiet peace of the room wash over us. The $50 insult, the locked door, the cruise ship. I filed all of it away in a dark, cold corner of my mind. The time for confrontation would come soon enough. For now, my only job was to make sure she felt completely safe. I sat beside her until she finished the last crumb, my mind already calculating the precise steps I would take at dawn to freeze the trust accounts. The wrath of a betrayed father was coming, and it would be absolutely merciless. Maya's eyelids were drooping, the exhaustion of her traumatic night pulling her under. I took the tray from her lap, watching as she curled into the blankets. I sat perfectly still until her breathing deepened into a steady slumber. Then I stood up, crept out of the room, and pulled the door shut. I walked into my living room. It was past 4:30 in the morning. The Seattle sky was still a heavy black, mirroring the cold darkness in my heart. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the contact name of the boy I had raised. Derek. I pressed dial. It rang 3 times before clicking to voicemail. I ended the call and pressed dial again. 1 ring. Voicemail. I stood as still as a statue by the window, my thumb ending the call and hitting redial the second his recorded voice began. By the 7th attempt, my jaw was clenched. By the 11th attempt, profound disgust washed over me. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had poured into his college tuition, his first car, and his lavish wedding. I spent my entire life shielding him from discomfort, and this was the man he had become. A man who would ignore his father in the middle of the night. A man who would lock a child in a cage. I pressed dial for the 14th time, deciding that if he did not answer, I would drive directly to the police precinct to report him for abandonment. The line rang once. It rang twice. Then a sharp click signaled the connection. The sound from the speaker was incredibly jarring. It was a chaotic symphony of tropical vacation noise. I heard the rhythmic beating of steel drums, the rushing ocean wind across an open microphone, and the carefree laughter of a crowd. It was the unmistakable sound of a luxury cruise ship in full swing, completely insulated from the reality of the real world. "Dad, what in the world is going on?" Derek's voice cut through the background music. His words were slightly slurred, thick with the lethargy of expensive alcohol and profound annoyance. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a lethal, freezing calm. "Where are you?" I asked. I heard him sigh heavily, an exasperated sound, as if I were a telemarketer bothering him during dinner. "We are on the cruise, Dad. The Caribbean trip. I told you we were going. We needed a family reset." "You left Maya locked in a bedroom with a plastic bottle of water and dry crackers," I stated, ignoring his casual tone. "I broke through your back door tonight. I pulled her out of the dark." There was a brief pause on the line. It was not the pause of a horrified parent realizing a mistake. It was the calculated pause of a man caught in an inconvenience, quickly scrambling to formulate an exit strategy. "Dad, calm down." Derek snapped, his voice rising defensively over the steel drums. "You are making a massive deal out of absolutely nothing. Maya spiked a high fever yesterday afternoon right before we were supposed to leave. You left a 6-year-old child alone in a house because she had a fever." I asked, the sheer audacity of his words making my stomach churn. "She is not alone," Derek fired back, sounding genuinely irritated. "We planned this $20,000 trip for an entire year. We could not let her infect Hunter and completely ruin the reset we desperately needed. Hunter was really looking forward to the water slides. We could not just cancel everything." "So you abandoned her?" "I did not abandon anyone," he argued. "Lexi, the 17-year-old girl next door, is a pro babysitter. She is watching her. We paid her well. You probably just walked into the house while Lexi was in the bathroom. Seriously, stop overreacting and let us enjoy our trip. We need this peace." I stood in my dark living room, absorbing the magnitude of his lie. It was a perfectly constructed, plausible excuse designed to make me feel like a paranoid, meddling old man. He used the word reset to justify his selfishness. He used a fictional fever to justify protecting his biological son while discarding his adopted daughter. He claimed a high school teenager was providing professional care. "Drix," I began, my voice dangerously low. "Dad, I have to go. Stephanie is waiting for me at the buffet. Just leave the house and let Lexi do her job." "Goodbye." The line went dead. The silence of my living room rushed back in, replacing the tropical music and clinking glasses. I lowered the phone. He had hung up on me. He felt no guilt. He felt no remorse. He only felt annoyed that his father interrupted his $20,000 vacation. He firmly believed his lie had worked. He thought he had successfully managed the situation. He thought I would simply turn around, walk out of his house, and leave his grand illusion intact. He was incredibly wrong. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. The lie about the fever was pathetic. The lie about the teenage babysitter was easily disproven. But the mention of the $20,000 trip sparked a terrifying realization in my mind. Derek was a mid-level manager at a struggling company. He did not have $20,000 in disposable income lying around for a sudden luxury cruise. But I knew exactly where that kind of money could be accessed. My late wife had established a trust fund for our grandchildren. I was the trustee, but I had given Derek a card for emergencies. I was not just going to catch him in a simple lie. I was going to follow the money. I needed to know exactly how he funded this betrayal. The kitchen clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passing of another minute in the deep quiet of my home. I took the empty tray from Maya's lap and set it on the nightstand. She rubbed her eyes, looking heavily fatigued, yet undeniably calmer than when I had found her locked in that terrible room. Before I let her completely succumb to sleep, I needed to check the foundation of Derek's elaborate excuse. He had claimed with such irritated conviction over the phone that she had spiked a severe fever. He used that supposed illness as the entire justification for abandoning his adopted daughter while taking his biological son on a luxury vacation. I walked into my master bathroom and retrieved a digital thermometer from the medicine cabinet. Returning to the guest bedroom, I sat back down on the edge of the mattress. Maya looked up at me with sleepy curiosity. "I need to take your temperature, sweetheart," I said in a gentle, reassuring tone. "Just a quick check to make sure you are healthy." She nodded obediently and opened her mouth. I placed the thermometer under her tongue and waited for the electronic beep. During those few seconds, I studied her small face, the lack of any flush on her cheeks, the clear, bright whites of her eyes. She did not look sick. She looked profoundly exhausted and emotionally traumatized, but physically she displayed absolutely zero symptoms of any flu. The thermometer beeped a sharp, clear note. I pulled it out and read the digital display. 98.6 degrees. It was a perfectly normal, undeniably healthy temperature. There was no fever. There had never been a fever. I felt a cold knot of disgust tighten in my stomach. The lie was not just an exaggeration. It was a complete fabrication, an alibi manufactured out of thin air to excuse the inexcusable. I pulled the heavy blankets up to her chin, kissed her forehead one more time, and promised her I would be right down the hall. I waited until her breathing slowed into the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Once I was certain she was resting comfortably, I walked back into my kitchen. It was approaching 5 in the morning. The pre-dawn darkness still blanketed the neighborhood, but my mind was operating with a sharp, tactical clarity. I could not simply rely on a normal temperature reading to build my case against my son. If I was going to legally strip him of his custody and dismantle his life, I needed airtight, undeniable evidence of his neglect. Derek had mentioned Lexi, the 17-year-old girl who lived right next door to them. He boldly claimed she was a professional babysitter hired and well compensated to watch Maya around the clock. I knew Derek's neighbors. I knew the teenage girl he was talking about. She was a high school student heavily involved in extracurricular activities, not a licensed childcare professional. I needed to hear the truth directly from her mouth before the sun came up. I grabbed my keys quietly, locked my front door, and climbed back into my truck. The drive back to Derek's upscale suburban neighborhood was completely devoid of traffic. The streets were eerily empty, mirroring the hollow emptiness I felt regarding my son's character. I parked my truck on the street directly in front of the neighbor's house, adjacent to the dark, silent structure where Maya had been caged just hours prior. I walked up the paved driveway, the cold morning air biting through my jacket. I stepped onto the wide front porch and pressed the illuminated doorbell button. I waited 10 seconds. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, holding it down longer this time, and then I knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. I knew it was incredibly early, but the safety of a child and the exposure of a dangerous lie took absolute precedence over neighborhood etiquette. A few moments later, a warm light flicked on in the front hallway. The door creaked open, slightly secured by a heavy brass chain. A groggy, confused teenage girl peered out at me. She was wearing oversized pajamas, her hair messy from sleep. It was Lexi. Lexi. I am Richard Caldwell. Derek's father, I said, keeping my voice low but commanding. I apologize for waking you at this hour, but I need to ask you a very important question about Maya. She blinked her eyes, adjusting to the porch light, her expression shifting from sleepy annoyance to genuine confusion. Maya. Is everything okay? I have to get ready for school in an hour. My son told me that he hired you to act as a full-time professional babysitter for Maya while he and Stephanie went on a cruise for the next 15 days, I stated clearly, watching her face closely for any sign of a micro-expression. Did he pay you to stay in their house and watch her? Lexi's jaw dropped slightly. The confusion on her face morphed instantly into profound disbelief. A full-time babysitter? No, absolutely not. I have midterms this week. I cannot stay at their house. Stephanie just knocked on our front door yesterday afternoon while she was rushing to load the car. What exactly did she say to you? I pressed my heart, turning into a block of ice. She handed me a single $100 bill, Lexi explained, her voice trembling slightly as she realized the gravity of the situation. She asked if I could just toss a lunchbox over the backyard fence once a day after I got home from school. She told me Maya was being severely grounded for bad behavior and needed to learn strict independence. I told her I was super busy with track practice and only had about 5 minutes a day to spare. Stephanie smiled and said that was perfectly fine, that Maya just needed a sandwich dropped over the gate. I thanked her and left. I stood on the cold concrete porch, the harsh yellow glare of the overhead light illuminating the sleepy, honest face of the teenage girl standing before me. She had just casually confirmed the absolute darkest depths of my son's depravity. I thanked her and left. Those were her final words about the brief exchange that sealed Maya's fate for the next 2 weeks. I looked at Lexi, realizing she was completely innocent, just a naive pawn manipulated by a master architect of deception. I forced a gentle, reassuring tone into my voice, telling her to go back to sleep and not to worry about another single thing regarding the lunchbox. I assured her that Maya was entirely safe with me now. She nodded slowly, closing the heavy wooden door, leaving me alone in the freezing pre-dawn air. I walked down the paved driveway, my boots echoing loudly in the quiet suburban street. Each step felt incredibly heavy, weighed down by the crushing reality of what my own flesh and blood had orchestrated. I climbed into the cab of my truck and shut the heavy door, sealing myself inside the quiet, cold interior. I did not turn the key in the ignition. I just sat there, silently gripping the steering wheel, letting the profound horror wash over my mind. My breathing was slow and measured, a forced rhythm to keep my chest from completely caving in. I reached into the breast pocket of my thick winter jacket and pulled out my smartphone. The glass screen illuminated the dark cabin, casting a pale, ghostly light across my trembling hands. I rarely paid attention to the endless stream of digital noise, but I knew Stephanie treated her online presence like a strict religion. She documented every curated second of their existence, building an elaborate, highly fictional narrative of a perfect, wealthy, loving family. I tapped the icon for the social media application and navigated directly to her public profile. My thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second, anticipating the sickening blow I was about to receive. I scrolled past the meticulously edited banners and the stylized biographical quotes, plunging straight into the visual feed. It was a digital facade of the highest order, a gallery of fake smiles, sponsored clothing, and artificial joy. And there it was, positioned right at the very top of her feed, posted just a few hours ago while Maya was shivering in the dark. The photograph was brilliantly composed, capturing the golden hour sunshine on the upper deck of a massive Royal Caribbean cruise liner. The ocean behind them was a vibrant, sparkling turquoise, contrasting perfectly with the crisp white railings of the luxury ship. Derek, Stephanie, and 8-year-old Hunter were standing close together, casually leaning against the glass balcony. They were dressed in matching resort wear, looking like a professional advertisement for upper-class tranquility. Derek held a tall, condensation-covered cocktail, his smile wide and completely devoid of any underlying guilt. Stephanie was glowing brightly, her head resting against his shoulder, holding a vibrant, tropical drink, beautifully garnished with a miniature umbrella. Hunter stood happily in front of them, proudly gripping a colorful mocktail, completely oblivious to the sister they had left behind in a cage. They looked so incredibly happy. They looked so unbelievably carefree. My eyes slowly drifted downward to the caption written beneath the photograph. It was typed out with her usual sickening, performative enthusiasm. Much needed family reset. So sad our little Maya got the flu, but we know she is resting well. We will miss her, but sometimes you just have to prioritize your peace. I read those terrible words over and over again, letting the sheer unfiltered malice of that statement burn directly into my vision. So sad our little Maya got the flu. Resting well. Prioritize your peace. The psychological disgust I felt in that exact moment was entirely overwhelming. It was a deep physical revulsion, a sickness that churned violently deep within my stomach. They had weaponized a fictitious illness to excuse their monstrous behavior, transforming their deliberate act of child abandonment into a story of unfortunate circumstances that demanded public sympathy. They were actively harvesting digital validation from hundreds of naive strangers, while the child they legally swore to protect was expected to survive on dry crackers and warm tap water. This was not a momentary lapse in ethical judgment. This was not a frantic, panicked mistake made by overwhelmed parents. This was a cold, calculated execution of absolute cruelty, polished and perfectly packaged for public consumption. Every single comment directly beneath the photograph was a sickening echo of support, wishing them a wonderful vacation and sending prayers for Maya to recover quickly. The absolute unmitigated audacity of their lie was breathtaking. I turned the screen off, plunging the cab of my truck back into total darkness. The last lingering shreds of my paternal instinct, that desperate, foolish urge to find an excuse or a rational explanation for my son, completely evaporated into the freezing air. It was instantly replaced by a cold, radiating rage. This was not anger. Anger is hot and chaotic. Anger makes you yell and break things. What I felt was a freezing, highly surgical wrath. Derek and Stephanie had ceased to be my family the very moment they locked that bedroom door. They were now simply targets. They were abusers who had hidden their monstrous nature behind a pristine, wealthy suburban facade. I looked out the windshield toward the direction of my house, knowing that a traumatized little girl was finally sleeping safely in a warm bed. I made a silent, unbreakable promise to her right then and there. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. I was going to tear down their financial security, shatter their carefully curated public image, and ensure they faced the maximum penalty under the law. I turned the key, the heavy engine roaring to life, ready to begin. The headlights of my truck pierced the lingering darkness as I pulled away from the curb. My immediate priority was the fragile life waiting for me. I navigated the empty suburban streets with mechanical precision. When I finally turned into my own driveway, the sky was just beginning to bleed a bruised purple along the eastern horizon. My brick home felt like a war room. I unlocked the front door and moved silently down the hallway. I pushed open the door to the guest bedroom. The light from the hallway illuminated the small, still form huddled under the thick quilt. Maya had not moved since I left. I walked over to the mattress and sat down carefully. I reached out and gently adjusted the comforter, pulling it snug against her shoulders. As my hand brushed against her cheek, her eyes fluttered open. They were wide, dark pools of quiet apprehension. "Are you awake, sweetie?" I asked softly, keeping my voice as gentle as the morning air. She did not look at me. Her gaze bypassed my face and locked onto the white expanse of the ceiling. She lay perfectly still, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket. The silence in the room stretched out until she finally parted her dry lips. "Mommy said I am broken." The words were spoken in a whisper so faint I almost missed them, but they hit my chest like a physical blow. "What did you say, Maya?" She did not blink. She just kept staring upward. "Mommy said I am broken. She said she is sending me back to the factory." My blood instantly ran cold. Sending me back to the factory. The phrase echoed in my mind, a chilling mechanical metaphor that no 6-year-old child could invent on her own. It was a direct quote. It was a concept embedded into her developing brain by a woman who viewed human beings as disposable commodities. The sheer horror of that statement began to wash over me, rearranging everything I thought I knew. "When did she say this to you, Maya?" I asked, fighting the tremor in my voice. "Yesterday," she murmured, her voice flat. "Before they locked the door. She said the reset was not working. She said I was a defective model and that when they got back, I was going back to the factory to be fixed. She said someone else could deal with the broken parts." I closed my eyes, a wave of profound nausea hitting me. The factory. They were not talking about a medical facility. They were talking about the foster care system. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. This was not merely a case of temporary neglect while they took a selfish vacation. This was the preliminary stage of a permanent disposal. Stephanie and Derek had adopted this little girl to fulfill a highly curated, deeply narcissistic image of themselves. They had used her story to build a lucrative online platform, harvesting the praise of thousands of strangers. But behind the camera, the reality of raising a traumatized child was too inconvenient for their aesthetic. She was not a prop they could put in a closet. She was a living child who needed immense patience. When she proved to require actual parenting, they labeled her a defective model. They were planning to completely abandon her to the state the moment their luxury cruise concluded. The locked room, the $50 bill, the teenage neighbor dropping a lunchbox over the fence. It was all designed to distance themselves, to emotionally detach before making the final legal separation. They were abandoning her like a leased vehicle. I looked down at the little girl lying in my guest bed. She genuinely believed she was a broken object. The psychological damage inflicted upon her in that pristine house was unimaginable. She had internalized their monstrous narrative, accepting her fate as a discarded item waiting for return shipping. I gently placed my hand over her small, trembling fingers. I squeezed them tightly. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya," I said, forcing her to meet my eyes. "You are not broken. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you. You are perfect exactly the way you are, and you are never ever going to any factory. Do you understand me?" She blinked, a single tear escaping the corner of her eye. "Are you sure, Grandpa?" "I am absolutely sure," I promised. "You are staying right here with me. No one is ever going to lock you in a room again. No one is ever going to call you broken. You are my granddaughter, and I will protect you from anyone who tries to say otherwise." She let out a long, shaky breath, her eyes finally fluttering shut, as the exhaustion overtook her anxiety. I sat beside her for another hour, watching the morning sunlight begin to filter through the window blinds. The sorrow I felt for her was immense, but it was quickly being overshadowed by a calculating, ruinous wrath. My son and his wife had crossed a line that fundamentally erased their humanity. They were planning to discard a child after using her for social media clout and financial sponsorships. I stood up from the edge of the bed, my path forward entirely clear. I was not just going to report them for criminal neglect. I was going to financially and legally obliterate them. I would freeze the trust funds, seize the assets I had co-signed, and ensure their carefully constructed digital empire came crashing down in a spectacular public inferno. They wanted to rehome this child like a piece of broken furniture. I was going to make absolutely sure they never lived a day of peace for the rest of their miserable lives. I walked out of the quiet room, firmly closed the door, and picked up my phone to call my lawyer. The war for her future had officially begun this very morning. I stepped out of the guest bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. The house was dead quiet save for the hum of the refrigerator. I walked straight to my home office, a room lined with the leather-bound books and filing cabinets that held the sum of my long, hard work. I picked up my phone from the mahogany desk and checked the time. It was barely 6 in the morning, a completely unreasonable hour to call a corporate attorney, but reason had left the building the moment I found Maya locked in that dark room. I found the contact for Martin Gallagher and pressed the green call button. Martin had been my legal counsel and friend for 3 decades. He had drafted the very trust documents I was about to weaponize. The line rang several times. I listened to the monotonous tone, my foot tapping a relentless rhythm against the hardwood floor. Finally, a groggy, rough voice answered. "Richard." "What is wrong?" Martin rasped, the sleep thick in his throat. "Has something happened?" I did not bother with pleasantries or apologies for waking him. "Martin, I need you to pull the records for the grandchildren trust immediately," I said. My voice was stripped of any warmth, projecting a flat, absolute authority. "I need a comprehensive audit of every single transaction made over the last 6 months, specifically targeting the secondary access card I authorized for Derek." Martin paused, clearly taken aback by my tone. "Richard, it is 6 in the morning on a Saturday. The banks are closed. I can initiate the request on Monday." "No, Martin," I interrupted, gripping the edge of my desk. "I need you to use your emergency access portals right now. I need the digital ledgers sent to my encrypted email within the hour, and I need the card frozen immediately. Deny all future transactions." The severity of my demand finally pierced through his fatigue. There was a shift in his breathing, a sudden alertness. "Did Derek do something, Richard? Are we looking at a breach of fiduciary duty?" "We are looking at something far worse," I replied. "But right now I need the financial footprint. Just get me those records, Martin. I will explain everything once I have the proof in front of my eyes." I heard the rustling of sheets and the heavy thud of a man swinging his legs out of bed. "Give me 45 minutes," Martin said, his voice now entirely professional. "I will pull the recent digital statements from the banking portal and freeze the secondary card." The line went dead. I set the phone down and walked into the kitchen. The waiting was a suffocating physical presence. It wrapped around my chest, making every breath feel shallow and inadequate. I went through the mechanical motions of making a pot of dark coffee. I measured the grounds, poured the filtered water, and pressed the brewing switch. The machine hissed and sputtered, a slow, agonizing drip of black liquid falling into the glass carafe. I stood perfectly still, watching the steam rise, my mind racing through the parameters of the trust. My late wife Eleanor had established that fund with the singular explicit purpose of securing the educational future of our grandchildren and covering any catastrophic medical emergencies. It was sacred money born from decades of our shared sacrifice. I had given Derek a secondary access card purely as a fail-safe. It was a safety net in case Maya or Hunter ever needed immediate medical attention and I could not be reached. The realization that he had used her dying legacy to fund a luxury cruise filled me with explosive rage. I poured the hot coffee into a ceramic mug, the bitter scent grounding me. I carried the mug back to my office and sat down in my heavy leather chair. I stared at the blank screen of my computer monitor, watching my own dark reflection. The minutes dragged by with agonizing slowness. I watched the digital clock in the corner of the screen change from 6:20 to 6:30. Each tick of the clock felt like a hammer striking an anvil in my mind. At exactly 6:48, a sharp chime echoed from my computer speakers. A new email had arrived in my secure inbox. The sender was Martin Gallagher. The subject line read, "Requested trust documents." I set my coffee mug down so forcefully that dark liquid splashed over the rim, staining the wood. I did not care. My hands were shaking as I clicked the mouse, opening the attached spreadsheet. The document loaded columns of financial data filling the bright screen. I scrolled past the historical data, bypassing the modest legitimate withdrawals I had authorized last year. I navigated directly to the activity logged under the secondary access card within the last 90 days. The numbers on the screen confirmed my worst suspicions, but the sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. It was not just a charge for a $20,000 cruise. The ledger read like a catalog of extreme narcissism. There was a charge for $4,000 at an exclusive dentistry clinic. There was an $8,000 transaction at a luxury jewelry boutique. I scrolled down, my eyes burning with grief and fury. 2 weeks ago, a massive withdrawal of $22,500 had been wired to Royal Caribbean International. Derek had not just dipped into the emergency fund. He had maliciously treated the legacy of his deceased mother like a personal slush fund to finance their opulent vacation. Every dollar stolen was an insult to the woman who gave him life. He had robbed his own children to buy mocktails on a sun-drenched deck while leaving his daughter to starve. I printed the ledger, the machine whirring as it produced the evidence. I gathered the papers, feeling the weight of the betrayal. The trap was armed, and I was ready to strike. The heavy printer in the corner of my office finished spitting out the pages, the mechanical whirring fading into the silent room. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, stacking them neatly on the surface of my mahogany desk. The top page displayed the unmistakable logo of the bank that held the grandchildren's trust. I stared at the bold black numbers printed across the columns, feeling the physical weight of my son's ultimate betrayal. $22,500. That was the exact figure transferred directly from the Sacred Emergency Fund to Royal Caribbean International. I ran my index finger across the printed ink, tracing the line of the transaction. It was a staggering sum drained from an account that my late wife Eleanor had painstakingly built to secure their future. Derek had not simply maxed out a credit card or taken out a reckless loan. He had maliciously stolen from his own children just to seamlessly finance his tropical escape. But large trust withdrawals were not simple matters. Eleanor and I had designed the fund with strict safeguards. A withdrawal of that magnitude required specific documentation. I sat back in my leather chair and began scrolling through the digital files Martin had attached to the email. There had to be an authorization form, a declared purpose for releasing such a significant amount of capital. I found a subfolder labeled Authorization Requests and clicked it open. My screen was immediately filled with official-looking medical invoices and a formal petition signed with a digital replica of my own name. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted letterhead. It was a clinic out of state, a pediatric behavioral health facility. My heart began to pound, a very slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs, as I carefully read the forged justification. The document claimed that Maya was suffering from severe, uncontrollable behavioral regressions stemming from her early childhood trauma. It stated that she required an immediate intensive out-of-state emergency therapeutic retreat. The invoice itemized the costs for specialized counseling, 24-hour supervision, and holistic family integration therapy. The total perfectly matched the $22,500 wired to the cruise line. I felt a cold, blinding wrath wash over my entire body. Derek and Stephanie had not just stolen the money. They had manufactured a fictitious mental health crisis for their adopted daughter to bypass the security protocols of the trust. They had legally documented her as severely unstable just to blindly justify liquidating her own future security. The absolute profound wickedness of their calculated strategy was almost too massive for me to comprehend. They had literally used Maya's traumatic past, the very vulnerability they had promised to heal, as the financial lever to fund a luxury vacation. They had submitted forged medical invoices to drain her trust fund, took the money, bought VIP suite tickets for themselves and their biological son, and then locked the supposedly unstable child in a dark room with a box of dry crackers. The level of sociopathic calculation required to execute this plan was staggering. They had weaponized her existence to pay for her exclusion. Every sip of champagne they took on that ship was paid for by the fabricated suffering of a little girl they had left behind like trash. I picked up my phone and pressed Martin's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and wide awake. "Did you review the ledgers, Richard?" he asked. "I did, Martin." I replied, my voice stripped of all emotion, reduced to a flat, dangerous calm. Derek submitted a fraudulent medical invoice claiming Maya needed an emergency therapeutic retreat. He forged my authorization signature and wired the funds directly to a cruise line. They are currently in the Caribbean, sitting in a luxury suite paid for by the trust. Martin was dead silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with legal apprehension. "Richard, that is not just a breach of fiduciary duty. That is felony wire fraud. That is grand larceny on a massive scale." "I know exactly what it is, Martin," I said. "And I want you to initiate the process for a full criminal referral. I want the trust entirely locked down. Revoke his secondary access flag the previous transaction as fraudulent and prepare the documents to sever his guardianship. He left Maya locked in a room tonight. I broke into the house and brought her here. She is safe, but I am going to need you to draft an emergency petition for sole temporary custody first thing on Monday morning." Martin did not hesitate. "Consider it done, Richard. Do you want me to contact the local authorities regarding the child endangerment?" "Not just yet," I instructed him. "I want to build an insurmountable wall of evidence first." I ended the call and set the phone down next to the printed ledgers. The early morning light was finally breaking through the heavy curtains of my office, casting long shadows across the room. I looked at the forged medical document on my screen one last time. They thought they were incredibly clever. They thought they had bypassed the system, secured their dream vacation, and effectively disposed of the child they no longer wanted to parent. They had built an entire digital kingdom on a foundation of lies and theft. But they had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the man who built their safety net. I stood up from my heavy wooden desk, leaving the sensitive documents neatly organized for the brutal war ahead. I was going to let them enjoy the warm ocean breeze for a few more days. I was going to let them sip their drinks and post their smiling photographs for the whole world to see. Because when they finally stepped off that luxury ship, there would be no home to return to, no money to spend, and absolutely no mercy left to give. Monday morning arrived with a cold, gray light creeping through the windows of my home. The weekend had been a blur of gentle reassurance for Maya, cooking warm meals and sitting quietly by her side as she slowly realized she was actually safe. My phone had buzzed several times over the past 48 hours. Derek had sent a handful of text messages. They were casual, breezy updates about the weather in the Bahamas, complaining about the lines at the buffets, and casually reminding me to make sure Lexi was doing her job with the lunchbox. He even had the audacity to ask me to water the front lawn of his house if I happened to drive by. I read every single message, but I did not reply. I did not call him to scream. I did not send a fiery text demanding an explanation. I gave him absolute total silence. It was the most disciplined thing I have ever done in my entire life. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to unleash my fury, to tell him I knew about the forged medical documents and the stolen trust money, to make him feel the terror he had inflicted upon that little girl. But alerting a criminal to his impending doom only gives him time to hire a defense attorney and destroy evidence. I needed him to stay relaxed. I needed him to stay firmly wrapped in his arrogant illusion of safety until the very last possible second. I wanted him to savor the ocean air completely unaware of the absolute destruction awaiting him. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into the downtown offices of Martin Gallagher. The reception area was quiet, smelling of leather and polished wood. Martin met me at the glass doors, his face drawn and highly serious. He led me back to his corner office overlooking the city skyline. I placed the thick manila folder onto his broad oak desk. Inside were the printed financial ledgers, the copies of the forged pediatric behavioral health invoices, and the photographs I had taken of the sterilized kitchen, the single $100 bill, and the locked guest bedroom door. Martin opened the folder and began to review the documents in silence. I watched his expression shift from professional detachment to profound disgust. He traced the signature on the fraudulent medical authorization, comparing it to my actual signature on the trust charter. It was a remarkably good forgery, but under Martin's practiced eye, the subtle hesitations of the pen stroke were obvious. When he finally looked up, he took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He had known Derek since he was a little boy playing in my backyard. Processing the reality of this sociopathic behavior was extremely difficult for him, but I had absolutely no room for sentimentality. We needed to act right now. I want the emergency ex parte custody order filed before noon. I stated, my voice echoing with a flat mechanical precision. I want full temporary physical and legal custody of Maya immediately. You have the photographic evidence of the environment they left her in. You have the sworn affidavit from the teenage neighbor confirming she was hired to drop a lunchbox over the fence for a child left entirely alone. That thoroughly covers the severe child abandonment and extreme criminal endangerment charges today. Martin nodded, pulling a yellow legal pad toward him. We will file the custody petition directly with the family court judge. Given the irrefutable physical evidence of deliberate neglect and your standing as the biological grandfather, the judge will grant the emergency order immediately. Once they return from their trip, they will not even be legally allowed to approach her. But what about the financial crimes, Richard? Are you absolutely certain you want to pull this trigger right now? Once I submit this detailed fraud report to the district attorney, the state will take over the entire process without hesitation. Derek will face mandatory minimums for grand larceny and wire fraud. He will undoubtedly go to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. Stephanie will be charged as a direct willing accomplice to the theft. They will lose their home, their freedom, their reputations, and their biological son forever. I looked out the massive glass window at the sprawling city far below us. I thought about the words Maya had whispered in the dark, about being a broken model sent back to the factory. I thought about the $22,500 they had maliciously stolen to buy luxury suites and tropical cocktails. There was no hesitation left in my soul. File the criminal referral, Martin. I said, meeting his gaze with an unblinking, absolute resolve. I want every single stolen dollar traced. I want their bank accounts frozen pending the criminal investigation. They viewed that precious little girl as a disposable commodity, a mere prop to be casually discarded when it became slightly inconvenient for their lifestyle. They stole from a sacred medical trust fund to directly finance their cruelty. I am not going to protect him just because he happens to share my last name. He completely stopped being my son the very moment he put a heavy padlock on a terrified child's bedroom door. Martin slowly nodded, picking up his silver fountain pen. He clearly recognized that the man sitting across from his wooden desk was no longer a grieving, disappointed father, but a cold, calculating executioner. He immediately began to meticulously draft the heavy legal guillotine that would permanently sever Derek and Stephanie from civilized society. I walked out of the quiet law office exactly 1 hour later, stepping back into the freezing city air. The paperwork was officially filed. The inescapable trap was set. All I had to do now was calmly wait for the luxury cruise ship to finally dock. Their meticulously fabricated kingdom of lies was about to be burned directly to the ground. The massive glass walls of the International Departure Terminal stretched high above us, filtering the bright morning sun across the polished terrazzo floors. The airport was a chaotic symphony of rolling luggage, overlapping intercom announcements, and rushed travelers hurrying toward their respective gates. I walked with a slow, deliberate pace, keeping my strides perfectly matched to the small, hesitant steps of the little girl beside me. My right hand enveloped Maya's left hand, securing her fingers with a firm, unwavering grip. She stayed close to my leg, her wide eyes darting around the cavernous building with a mixture of overwhelming awe and lingering apprehension. She had never been inside an airport before. Her entire world had been confined to the sterile, unloving boundaries of a house that treated her like a burden. I looked down at the hand holding hers. The solid gold wedding band resting on my ring finger caught the sunlight, gleaming with a quiet, enduring strength. It was the ring Eleanor had placed there over 40 years ago. As I felt the smooth metal press against my skin, a vivid memory of my late wife surfaced in my mind, washing over me with startling clarity. It was a warm summer evening years before the sickness took her, and we were sitting on the back porch listening to the crickets. She had been reading an article about children in the foster care system, and I remembered the fierce protective light that sparked in her eyes. She had reached over, covered my hand with hers, and made me promise her something. She told me that if we ever encountered a life that had been fractured by the cruelty of the world, we had a moral obligation to be the ones who offered safety. We must always protect the vulnerable, Richard, she had whispered, her voice resonating with absolute conviction. We have been blessed with stability, and it is our duty to share that armor with those who have none. Eleanor would have absolutely adored Maya. She would have wrapped this quiet, traumatized child in a blanket of unconditional affection, reading her stories and teaching her how to plant flowers in the garden. The realization that our own biological son was the very monster we had sworn to protect the vulnerable against was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow. But I was not going to let his profound failure tarnish Eleanor's legacy. I squeezed Maya's hand gently, drawing her attention away from a loud group of passing tourists. She looked up at me, her dark eyes still carrying the heavy shadows of the locked room she had survived just 2 nights prior. "Are we going on an airplane, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fragile excitement. She was wearing a new soft pink sweater and holding a small plush bear I had purchased at a terminal kiosk. "Yes, sweetheart, we are," I replied, my voice projecting a deep, resonant calm. I crouched down on one knee, right there in the middle of the busy concourse, completely ignoring the rush of people flowing around us. I needed to look directly into her eyes, leveling my gaze with hers, so she could understand the absolute certainty of my words. "We are going on a very important adventure." She clutched the plush bear tighter to her chest. "Are we going to the factory?" she whispered, the fear instantly returning to her expression, clouding her features with sudden dread. I felt a sharp, agonizing twist in my chest at her question, but I kept my face perfectly composed. I reached out and gently smoothed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "No, Maya. We are never going to any factory," I promised her, articulating every single syllable with unwavering authority. "I told you before, you are not broken. There is absolutely nothing defective about you. You are a perfectly wonderful, beautiful little girl." "Do you remember what I said?" She nodded slowly, though the doubt still lingered in her gaze. "But you know what?" I continued, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "There are some things in this world that are actually broken. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us turn out to be the ones who are completely defective. They lose their hearts, and they lose their minds, and they forget how to love. That is what is truly broken. So you and I are going on a trip across the ocean to fix the broken things. We are going to make sure that the people who hurt you can never ever hurt anyone else again." Maya stared at me, processing my words. The concept of her parents being the broken ones rather than herself was entirely foreign to her. I could see the wheels turning behind her dark eyes as she tried to reconstruct her understanding of the world. She took a deep, steadying breath and stood a little taller. "Are we going to fix them, Grandpa?" she asked softly. "No, sweetheart." I answered, my tone turning dangerously cold for a fraction of a second before I softened it again for her sake. "We are going to stop them. We are going to hold them accountable. And then we are going to come back home, and you are going to live with me forever, where you will always be safe." A tiny, almost imperceptible smile broke through the tension on her face. She leaned forward and wrapped her small arms around my neck, burying her face into my shoulder. I held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her clean hair, feeling a massive surge of protective energy fortify my spirit. I stood back up, lifting her into my arms so she would not have to walk through the crowded boarding gate. I carried her down the long jet bridge, stepping onto the aircraft that would carry us directly toward the confrontation I had meticulously planned. The flight was long, but Maya slept peacefully against my side, completely exhausted by the emotional turbulence of the past 48 hours. I stayed awake the entire time, my mind running through the tactical logistics of the upcoming strike. The heavy tropical humidity of Nassau hit us the moment we stepped out of the international airport terminal. The Bahamian air was thick with the scent of salt water and sweet flowers, a jarring contrast to the freezing morning we had left behind. A private town car I had chartered in advance was waiting at the curb. I secured Maya safely in the back seat and instructed the driver to head directly to the cruise terminal. As the vehicle navigated the vibrant, colorful streets of the island, the massive silhouette of the Royal Caribbean ship slowly emerged on the horizon. It was an absolute behemoth of white steel and tinted glass, a floating city dedicated entirely to gluttony, excess, and leisure. It towered over the local buildings, casting a massive shadow across the sparkling turquoise harbor. As we approached the port, the sheer magnitude of the vessel became staggering. Thousands of passengers were moving through the terminal, laughing, drinking from plastic coconuts, and complaining about the heat. It was a carnival of privilege. I looked at Maya, who was staring out the tinted window of the car, completely overwhelmed by the scale of the ship. She looked so incredibly small against the backdrop of this massive floating playground. The absolute cruel irony of her situation burned freshly in my mind. Derek and Stephanie had used the money intended for this little girl's future medical and educational needs to finance their presence on this ridiculous monument to indulgence. They had locked her in a dark, terrifying cage while they basked in the tropical sun. I had utilized my extensive resources to secure a last-minute, highly exclusive boarding pass. Because I had the physical documents proving my biological relation to Derek and the emergency temporary custody order in my briefcase, navigating the port security was a swift, efficient process. I held Maya's hand firmly as we crossed the gangway and stepped into the main promenade of the ship. The interior was a visual assault. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, illuminated glass elevators soared through the central atrium, and a live band played cheerful music near a massive artificial waterfall. The noise and the bright lights made Maya flinch, shrinking closer to my leg. I knelt down and picked her up, carrying her through the throngs of sunburned tourists. I was not going to drag her through this chaos aimlessly. I needed exact coordinates. I bypassed the crowded guest services counters and walked directly toward the VIP concierge lounge, a secluded area guarded by heavy glass doors and a velvet rope. The attendant behind the mahogany desk looked up with a polished, professional smile that faltered slightly when he saw my uncompromising expression. I set Maya down gently in a plush leather armchair near the entrance, instructing her to sit quietly for just 1 minute. I stepped up to the desk, projecting the absolute authority of a man who owned the very ground he was standing on. "I need specific information regarding a passenger currently on board," I stated, keeping my voice low so only the attendant could hear. "I am very sorry, sir, but we have strict privacy policies regarding our guests," the young man replied smoothly, falling back on his corporate training. "I am afraid I cannot disclose any locations or itineraries." I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and produced a crisp, unmarked $500 bill. I placed it flat on the pristine surface of the mahogany desk, keeping my hand resting casually over it. I leaned forward, locking my eyes entirely onto his. "This is not a social inquiry," I said, my tone dipping into a cold, dangerous register. "My son Derek Caldwell is currently traveling in one of your luxury suites with his wife Stephanie. There has been a severe family emergency. I need to know exactly where they are dining this evening. I am not asking for a room key, and I am not asking you to violate security protocols. I just need a restaurant name and a reservation time." The attendant looked at the bill, then back up at my face. He swallowed hard, recognizing that refusing me would be a monumental mistake. He subtly slid a piece of paper over the cash, pulling it toward his keyboard. He typed frantically for a few seconds, his eyes scanning the glowing monitor. "They are dining at the Chops Grill, sir," he whispered, his voice tight. "It is our exclusive premium steakhouse on Deck 8. They have a reservation for a private table near the aft windows at 7:30 this evening." "Thank you for your exceptional assistance," I replied, turning away before he could offer another word. I walked back to Maya, offering her my hand. She took it eagerly, and we made our way toward Deck 8. The ship was vast, but my internal compass was locked onto my target. I was a heat-seeking missile closing in on a completely oblivious mark. We arrived at the entrance of the restaurant just as the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant shades of crimson and gold. The steakhouse was a portrait of manufactured exclusivity. The lighting was remarkably dim, providing an atmosphere of intimate luxury. The air smelled of expensive wine-roasted garlic and perfectly seared meat. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved silently between the heavy mahogany tables, carrying silver trays and crystal decanters. I did not approach the hostess stand. I guided Maya away from the main entrance, finding a secluded alcove in the shadows just outside the frosted glass walls of the dining room. From this vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed line of sight into the restaurant. I stood perfectly still in the quiet darkness, holding Maya's hand, watching the affluent crowd enjoy their exorbitant meals. It took only a few minutes to locate them. Derek, Stephanie, and young Hunter were seated at a premium table directly against the panoramic windows, laughing and clinking their elegant glasses together in a joyful toast. Stephanie was wearing a shimmering evening gown, her hair perfectly styled, holding her phone up to record another video of their perfect family vacation. Derek was smiling widely, completely relaxed, cutting into a massive, expensive steak. They looked utterly invincible. I watched them celebrate, my heart beating with a slow, terrifying rhythm. They were currently residing at the absolute peak of their arrogance, fully believing they had outsmarted the world and disposed of their problem without a single consequence. They had no idea that the factory they had threatened Maya with was not coming for her. The consequence was standing right outside the glass, waiting in the shadows, holding the hand of the child they had thrown away. I took a deep breath, preparing to shatter their perfect illusion into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I guided Maya away from the frosted glass exterior of the restaurant and moved with absolute stealth toward the grand entrance. The hostess was currently overwhelmed by a large party of tourists loudly complaining about their reservation time. I used the distraction to slip silently past the mahogany podium, my hand firmly securing Maya's small fingers. We navigated through the dimly lit periphery of the dining room, avoiding the direct glow of the crystal chandeliers. I found exactly what I needed. It was a deeply recessed alcove designed for private service staff, shielded from the main dining floor by a thick wooden lattice and a row of tall, leafy artificial palm trees. It was situated mere feet from the back of the plush leather booth where my son was currently holding court. I sat down on a small wooden service bench hidden within the shadows of the alcove and lifted Maya onto my lap. I wrapped my arms around her, pressing her small head gently against my chest to muffle the surrounding noise. I leaned forward, resting my shoulder against the wooden lattice. Through the narrow gaps in the woodwork, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the back of Derek's head and the profile of his wife. They were not dining alone. Sitting directly across from them was an older, remarkably wealthy-looking couple. The man was wearing a bespoke linen suit and a heavy gold watch that caught the ambient light, while his wife was draped in expensive silk and sparkling diamond jewelry. They looked like quintessential cruise ship aristocracy, completely oblivious to the absolute monsters sitting across the table from them. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and slowly withdrew my smartphone. I dimmed the brightness of the screen to the lowest possible setting to avoid casting any light within the dark alcove. I opened the voice recording application, a tool I rarely used, and pressed the red button. The digital timer began to count the seconds, the visual audio waves spiking as it picked up the ambient noise of the steakhouse. I carefully slid the phone through a gap in the wooden lattice, resting it on a small decorative ledge just inches from the back of their booth. The microphone was perfectly positioned to capture every single syllable spoken at their table. I settled back into the shadows, wrapping my coat tighter around Maya to protect her from the heavy air conditioning of the restaurant. I forced my breathing to slow down, channeling my intense, burning fury into a state of absolute, calculated patience. I was going to let them dig their own graves with their own arrogant words. The conversation flowing from their table was a nauseating display of manufactured privilege. Derek was leaning back in his leather chair, holding a crystal glass of red wine, loudly boasting about his latest fictitious business conquests. He spoke with a smooth, practiced cadence, telling the older gentleman about his aggressive investment strategies and his supposed real estate acquisitions. He fabricated entire narratives of corporate dominance, building a massive tower of lies, specifically designed to impress the affluent stranger. The older man nodded along, thoroughly entertained by my son's deceptive charisma. Stephanie was equally engaged in her own performance. She was speaking to the wealthy woman, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, as she detailed her demanding life as a social media influencer and a dedicated mother. She complained about the exhausting pressures of maintaining a wellness brand while simultaneously managing the schedules of her incredibly gifted children. Every word she spoke was a meticulously crafted extension of her digital facade, a complete and utter denial of the horrifying reality she had left locked in a dark room back home. I sat in the darkness, listening to them casually consume dishes that cost hundreds of dollars, while I held the fragile, trembling child they had deliberately abandoned to starve. The contrast was so profoundly evil, it made my stomach churn with physical revulsion. Maya shifted slightly on my lap, burying her face deeper into my coat. I could feel the rapid, anxious beating of her tiny heart against my ribs. I placed a gentle, reassuring kiss on the top of her head, silently promising her that the nightmare was nearing its absolute end. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing screen of my phone, watching the audio waves record their endless stream of vanity. The waiter arrived at their table dramatically, presenting a massive, beautifully roasted prime rib and a fresh bottle of imported champagne. Stephanie laughed, a sharp, grating sound that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant, thanking the waiter with exaggerated politeness. The older couple raised their glasses, proposing a cheerful toast to new friendships and wonderful vacations. Derek and Stephanie clinked their glasses in return, their smiles wide and completely devoid of any human conscience. I remained perfectly still, a silent ghost, waiting in the periphery, letting the digital recorder capture the indisputable soundtrack of their extreme sociopathy. The trap was holding steady, and I simply had to wait for them to voluntarily step onto the trigger. The elaborate dinner progressed into its final stages, the table now littered with empty crystal glasses and the remnants of expensive desserts. The waiter poured the last measure of the imported champagne into Stephanie's glass. She picked it up, taking a long, indulgent sip, the alcohol clearly beginning to loosen her carefully guarded tongue. Her posture relaxed, and she leaned heavily against the plush leather backrest of the booth, her cheeks flushed with a noticeable warm glow. The wealthy woman sitting across from her, whose name I gathered was Cynthia, delicately wiped her mouth with a linen napkin and offered a sympathetic, deeply misguided smile. "I feel so terrible for you both," Cynthia murmured, her voice carrying clearly into my hidden alcove. "I saw the post on your social media page earlier today. It must be so incredibly heartbreaking to be on this wonderful vacation while your poor little daughter is at home battling the flu. You must be worried sick about her." Stephanie let out a long, heavy, incredibly dramatic sigh. She placed her champagne glass down and reached out to grasp Derek's hand, putting on a sickening display of unified parental grief. "It is an absolute nightmare, Cynthia," Stephanie replied, her voice dropping into a tone of manufactured sorrow. "But honestly, the flu is just a convenient excuse for the public. The truth is much more complicated. Reversing an adoption is an absolute legal nightmare, and we simply could not bring her with us." I felt my entire body go rigid. The breath caught in my throat, freezing in my lungs. Beside me, Maya went completely stiff. I immediately raised my hands and gently but firmly pressed them over her ears, desperate to block the horrifying words that were about to spill from her adoptive mother's mouth. I did not want her to hear the rest of this. I did not want her young soul to absorb the toxic poison Stephanie was casually serving with dessert. Cynthia gasped softly, leaning forward with sudden, morbid curiosity. "Reversing an adoption?" she asked, completely stunned. "Oh my goodness, Stephanie. I had absolutely no idea. That sounds terribly difficult. Why on earth would you have to do something like that?" Stephanie took another slow sip of her champagne, leaning closer to the center of the table. "Because quite frankly, she is completely unmanageable," Stephanie explained, her voice hardening with genuine unfiltered malice. "We tried everything. We truly did. We brought her into our beautiful home, we gave her everything a child could possibly want, but she is just fundamentally damaged. She does not fit our aesthetic. She ruins our peace. But the real reason, the reason we are actually celebrating on this trip," Stephanie paused, placing a hand over her flat stomach, her face breaking into a wide, triumphant smile. "I am pregnant, Cynthia. We just found out before we left. I am carrying our second biological son." Cynthia let out a loud, delighted squeal, completely ignoring the horrifying implications of the previous sentence. "Oh, Stephanie. Derek. That is magnificent news. A little brother for Hunter. Congratulations." "Thank you," Derek chimed in, his voice dripping with arrogant pride. "We are thrilled. It is exactly what our family needs to finally be complete." Stephanie nodded vigorously, her expression turning terrifyingly cold as she continued her explanation. "Exactly. And that is precisely why we had to make the difficult choice regarding Maya. I refused to let a defective gene pool share a roof with my real boys. I simply cannot have her traumatized, broken energy infecting my biological children. It is not safe and it is not fair to our real family. So we hired a highly discreet private broker out of Seattle to handle the transition. The very minute this ship docks back in port, they are coming to the house to collect her. We are packing her up and sending her back into the system. This vacation was our way of washing our hands of the entire failed experiment before the new baby arrives." The sheer, unadulterated evil of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A defective gene pool. My real boys. Packing her up and sending her back. They were discussing the disposal of a human being with the exact same casual indifference one might use to describe returning a flawed pair of shoes to a department store. They had completely dehumanized her. They had locked her in a room, abandoned her to the care of an oblivious teenager, and forged medical documents to steal her trust fund, all to finance a celebration of her impending disposal. The older couple sat in a stunned, awkward silence for a few seconds. The horrific reality of Stephanie's confession had clearly breached their insulated world, but the social pressure of the luxury environment prevailed. The older man awkwardly raised his glass, forcing a polite cough. Well, he muttered, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to judge his wealthy dining companions. Family is complex. Cheers to your new biological son. Derek raised his glass, clinking it against the older man's crystal. Cheers to new beginnings, he said smoothly. I sat in the crushing darkness of the alcove, my hands still pressed tightly over Maya's ears. My vision swam with a burning, blinding red haze. My heart pounded with the force of a sledgehammer against my ribs. Every single muscle in my body begged me to stand up, to shatter the wooden partition, to drag my son and his wife out of that booth by their throats and throw them directly into the dark ocean below. The urge for immediate physical violence was a living, breathing monster inside of me. But I looked down at the glowing screen of my smartphone resting on the wooden ledge. The digital timer continued to count upward. The audio waves continued to register every single damning confession. I had it all. I had the undisputed recorded proof of their extreme sociopathy, their deliberate abandonment, their financial theft, and their premeditated plan to permanently discard a child through a private, likely illegal shadow broker. The legal guillotine I had constructed with Martin Gallagher was now fitted with a perfectly sharpened, inescapable blade. I gently pulled my hands away from Maya's ears. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the dim light. I pulled her close, kissing her forehead, feeling the absolute certainty of my mission settle deep into my bones. The time for gathering evidence was officially over. I reached through the lattice, quietly retrieved my phone, and saved the audio file directly to my secure cloud server. The trap had been sprung. It was finally time to execute the sentence. I stood up from the wooden bench, lifted Maya into my arms, and stepped out of the shadows. I had lifted Maya into my arms, my muscles tensed and ready to step fully out of the concealing shadows of the wooden lattice. I was prepared to shatter their elegant dinner, to publicly expose the monsters sitting in that plush leather booth, and to watch the color completely drain from my son's arrogant face. But just as my leather boot edged toward the ambient light of the main dining room floor, the older gentleman sitting across from them leaned forward, swirling the dark amber liquid in his crystal glass. His next question paralyzed me, anchoring my feet to the floor and forcing me to pull Maya back into the dim safety of the alcove. I pressed my shoulder against the partition, my smartphone still securely in my hand, its digital recorder actively capturing every single sound. The wealthy man, whose name was Arthur, began speaking with a tone of jovial admiration mixed with genuine curiosity. You know, Derek, I have been meaning to ask you. Cynthia and I have cruised on this specific ship several times, and we are very familiar with the tier structure. You mentioned earlier that you are staying in the Royal VIP suite. That is the pinnacle of the entire vessel. It is an incredibly difficult reservation to secure, let alone afford, on such short notice. And with the private broker fees for your adoption transition, this must be a staggeringly expensive celebration. Business must be booming for you back in Seattle. I held my breath, waiting for my son to construct another elaborate lie. Another fabricated story of corporate success to feed this wealthy stranger's ego. Instead, Derek let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a sound that used to fill our home with joy when he was a boy, but now it sounded incredibly hollow, devoid of any genuine warmth. He reached for his wine glass, taking a slow, indulgent sip, before resting his elbows comfortably on the thick white tablecloth. Honestly, Arthur Derrick said, a wicked conspiratorial grin spreading across his face. Business is good, but I cannot take the credit for funding this particular luxury. The truth is, my old man has a massive trust fund set up. It was originally established by my late mother. She was a very prudent woman, always obsessing over safety nets and emergency planning. She legally earmarked the entire fund specifically for the educational and medical emergencies of the grandchildren. It is a very locked-down, restricted account. Arthur raised a silver eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the financial maneuvering. Restricted accounts are notoriously difficult to liquidate, he noted. How did you manage to access it for a leisure cruise? Derek chuckled again, a sound so deeply cynical it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. That is the beauty of the system, Arthur. It just requires a little creative paperwork. My father is the sole trustee, but he gave me a secondary access card for critical emergencies. He is a clueless old man, completely wrapped up in his grief and his tedious routines. He never actually checks the digital ledgers, so I simply drafted some fake therapy bills for the kid. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. My own son was sitting in a crowded premium restaurant, openly bragging to a complete stranger about defrauding his dead mother's legacy. I had my buddy who works in graphic design mock up a completely legitimate-looking invoice from a high-end pediatric behavioral health clinic. Derek continued, his voice dripping with unbearable smugness. We claimed that Maya was having severe psychological regressions and required an immediate out-of-state emergency therapeutic retreat to stabilize her behavior. The bank saw the medical coding, recognized my secondary authorization, and released the funds without a single question. It was brilliant. We pulled out over $22,000 in one sweep. Arthur let out a low whistle, clearly impressed by the sheer audacity of the scheme. That is incredibly risky, Derek. What happens when your father reviews the statements? He will not review them anytime soon, Derek replied confidently, waving his hand dismissively. The clueless old man operates entirely on blind trust. And the best part is, we did not just stop at the cruise. We intentionally overbilled the trust by a significant margin. With the overflow cash from the fake invoices, Stephanie and I finally bought that customized Porsche SUV we have been eyeing for the past 6 months. It is sitting in our garage right now, completely paid off. Stephanie chimed in, her voice bright and bubbly, completely unaffected by the criminal confession her husband had just casually delivered. It is absolutely gorgeous, Cynthia. Black leather interior, panoramic roof. It is the perfect vehicle for when our real baby arrives. We desperately needed an upgrade from that cramped sedan. Derek nodded, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. Exactly. And to answer your question, Arthur, about the risk. By the time my father ever realizes the money is gone, the kid will be permanently back in the foster system. We will tell him that the therapeutic retreat was a failure, that she was beyond our help, and that the state had to take her back for her own safety. We will have full legal deniability. We used her own medical trust to fund her exit strategy, and my father will be too ashamed of the failed adoption to ever dig deeply into the financials. It is a completely victimless crime, considering the money was just sitting there gathering dust. I stood in the dark alcove listening to the man I had raised reduce my late wife's sacred legacy to a slush fund for a luxury vehicle. He had stolen from his abandoned daughter, defrauded his father, and mocked the memory of his mother, all while sipping imported wine. The ultimate disrespect had been voiced, captured, and permanently sealed into the digital memory of my phone. The heavy, stifling atmosphere of the alcove seemed to press inward against my chest, but the suffocating pressure was no longer born of shock or disbelief. The intense, burning fury that had propelled me from my quiet home across the ocean and onto this floating monument to excess suddenly evaporated. It did not fade into sadness, nor did it dissipate into resignation. Instead, it instantly crystallized into something entirely different. It transformed into an absolute freezing clarity. It was a sensation of total emotional detachment, a profound internal shift that left my mind operating with the cold, frictionless precision of a well-oiled machine. I looked down at the small, fragile weight resting in my arms. Maya was clinging to my neck, her face buried deeply into the collar of my jacket. She was far too young to comprehend the intricate, malicious details of wire fraud, forged medical invoices, or restricted trust funds. She did not know what a secondary access card was, nor could she grasp the financial logistics of a customized Porsche. But children possess a raw, unfiltered intuition that adults often lose. She did not need to understand the exact vocabulary of the transaction to profoundly feel the absolute radiating malice in her adoptive parents' voices. She could feel the vibration of their cruelty through the thin wooden lattice separating us from their table. I could feel her tiny body trembling, a silent, continuous tremor of pure anxiety. I gently adjusted my grip, securing her weight against my hip, and brought both of my hands up to cover her ears once again. I pressed my palms gently but firmly against the sides of her head, completely sealing out the ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the monstrous laughter of the man who had promised to be her father. I looked at her dark hair, at the small plush bear she had wedged between our bodies, and a quiet, unshakable realization settled deeply into the very marrow of my bones. There was absolutely no redemption for my son. The Derek I had raised, the boy who had played in the autumn leaves and helped his mother bake holiday cookies, was completely dead. He had been hollowed out, his moral center entirely excavated and replaced by a bottomless, ravenous narcissism. He was a lost cause, a monster hiding behind a tailored suit and a charismatic smile. I could not save him. I could not rehabilitate his soul or lecture him into finding his conscience. All I could do now was protect the innocent collateral damage he intended to leave in his wake and ensure that the consequences of his actions were delivered with maximum devastating impact. The execution of his ruin had to be flawless. It could not be a messy, emotional confrontation in the middle of a crowded steakhouse. If I stepped out from behind this wooden screen right now, there would be yelling. There would be a public spectacle. Security would be called, the authorities in Nassau would become involved, and the entire situation would descend into chaotic, uncontrollable noise. But most importantly, a public confrontation would thoroughly terrify Maya. She had already endured enough trauma to fill multiple lifetimes. She did not need to witness a screaming match between the only father figure she had left and the people who had locked her in a cage. She needed stability. She needed quiet strength. Furthermore, confronting Derek now would give him the one thing he absolutely did not deserve. It would give him advanced warning. It would allow him to call his own lawyers from the ship, to start moving money, to attempt to delete digital files, and to mentally prepare a defense strategy before he even stepped off the vessel. I refused to grant him that luxury. I wanted him to enjoy every single remaining second of this opulent vacation. I wanted him to soak in the tropical sun, drink his expensive wine, and sleep deeply in his high-thread count sheets, completely swaddled in his arrogant delusion of invincibility. I wanted his return to reality to be a sudden, catastrophic freefall. I envisioned the exact sequence of events. He would disembark the ship in Seattle, tanned and well-rested, expecting to meet a shadowy broker to dispose of his daughter. Instead, he would arrive at his pristine suburban home to find the locks changed and a notice of foreclosure nailed directly to the front door. He would attempt to use his credit cards to book a hotel only to find every single account frozen by federal investigators. He would discover that his luxury vehicle had been impounded as an asset, purchased with stolen trust funds. He would find the emergency custody order stripping him of all parental rights, and he would ultimately find himself standing in a sterile courtroom, staring at the digital ledgers and the audio recordings that proved his undeniable guilt. I slowly lowered my hands from Maya's ears, wrapping my arms securely around her small back. She lifted her head, her dark eyes searching my face for reassurance in the shadows. "We are leaving now, sweetie," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly soft, ensuring not a single decibel carried over the wooden partition. "We have heard enough. It is time to go back to our room." She nodded obediently, resting her chin on my shoulder. I reached out, and carefully retrieved my smartphone from the decorative ledge. I stopped the recording and immediately uploaded the encrypted audio file to my secure external server, creating an untouchable permanent record of their confession. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned away from the glass. I carried Maya silently through the dim periphery of the restaurant, moving like a phantom past the busy waitstaff and the distracted patrons. We exited the steakhouse without drawing a single glance, stepping back out into the bright, noisy promenade of the ship. The contrast was jarring, but I moved with absolute unwavering purpose. We bypassed the crowded casinos and the glittering shopping boutiques, navigating the labyrinthine corridors until we reached the private elevators designated for the upper deck suites. I swiped my access card, and the glass doors slid open, carrying us away from the noise and the crowds. When we finally reached our secure suite, I set Maya down on the edge of the plush, king-sized bed. The room was quiet, heavily soundproofed against the chaotic energy of the ship. I walked over to the minibar, poured a small glass of filtered water, and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, drinking slowly, her eyes watching my every movement. "Grandpa," she asked, her voice small but steady, "are they going to be mad when we fix the broken things?" I knelt down in front of her, resting my hands gently on her knees. I looked deeply into her eyes, seeing the resilience that had somehow survived the darkness of that locked room. "Yes, Maya," I answered honestly, stripping away any false comfort. "They are going to be very mad, but they are never going to be able to hurt you again. They are going to lose everything they have because people who do bad things eventually have to pay for them." I stood up and walked over to the desk by the window. I opened my laptop, connecting to the ship's secure internet network. The final pieces of the puzzle needed to be assembled. I pulled up my encrypted email client and drafted a new message to Martin Gallagher. I attached the audio recording I had just captured, explicitly detailing the confession regarding the forged medical documents, the purchase of the vehicle with stolen funds, and the illegal plan to transfer Maya to a private broker. I instructed Martin to immediately forward the audio directly to the district attorney handling the fraud case and to file a secondary injunction against their physical assets. I hit send, watching the progress bar complete the upload. The freezing clarity in my mind settled into a permanent, unbreakable resolve. The trap was not just set. The jaws had already snapped shut, and Derek was completely oblivious to the steel teeth sinking into his future. I closed the laptop, turning my attention back to the little girl who was finally safe in my care. The execution had begun, and I was going to see it through to the absolute devastating end. The transition from the dim, quiet alcove into the vibrant, glowing atmosphere of the main dining room felt like stepping onto a theatrical stage. The rich scent of roasted garlic, seared prime beef, and heavy red wine hung thickly in the conditioned air. I moved with a slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried cadence. Maya rested her head securely against my collarbone, her small arms wrapped tightly around my neck. I could feel her rapid heartbeat pulsing against my chest, a fragile rhythm that fueled the absolute freezing clarity in my mind. I navigated the narrow pathways between the elegant mahogany tables, completely ignoring the curious glances of the wealthy patrons seated around us. My singular focus was the plush, semicircular leather booth, positioned directly against the expansive panoramic windows. My son and his wife were sitting there, completely immersed in their fabricated reality, basking in the warm golden glow of the setting sun filtering through the glass. Derek was in the middle of delivering another animated, completely fictitious anecdote to the older gentleman sitting across the table. His hands moved expressively, gesturing with his crystal wine glass, his face illuminated by a profound, arrogant satisfaction. Stephanie was leaning forward, offering a perfectly practiced, dazzling smile to the older woman. They were entirely captivated by their own performance, completely insulated by their stolen luxury. They had absolutely no warning. They had no opportunity to prepare their defenses or construct a plausible lie. I approached the table from the blind spot, just over Stephanie's right shoulder, my footsteps completely silenced by the thick, ornate carpeting of the steakhouse. I did not announce my presence. I simply stepped into the ambient light, directly beside their extravagant spread of caviar, fresh oysters, and imported champagne. Stephanie was the very first to notice the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Her head turned slightly, her eyes catching the movement in her peripheral vision. I watched the exact fraction of a second, when her gaze locked onto my face, and then immediately dropped down to the small, dark-haired child clinging to my chest. The psychological impact was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. The radiant artificial smile that had been plastered across her face literally melted away, replaced by a hollow gaping expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her meticulously constructed reality shattered in an instant. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly pale white. Her fingers went entirely numb. The delicate crystal champagne flute she had been holding slipped directly through her relaxed grip. It plummeted downward, striking the heavy base of the mahogany table before crashing onto the floor. The glass shattered into 100 glittering fragments, the sharp, violent noise cutting through the ambient hum of the restaurant like a gunshot. The sudden sound caused Derek to freeze mid-sentence. He blinked, annoyed by the interruption, and turned his head to see what his wife had dropped. His eyes traveled up the length of my dark winter coat, finally meeting my unwavering, completely emotionless stare. I watched the profound shock physically strike his body. The arrogant, booming confidence evaporated from his posture, instantly replaced by the raw, suffocating panic of a trapped animal. His jaw went entirely slack, his mouth hanging open in a silent, desperate attempt to form a coherent word. He looked at me, and then he looked at the daughter he had legally abandoned to a locked freezing room just 2 days prior. He physically recoiled, pressing his back hard against the plush leather booth as if trying to merge with the upholstery and disappear from existence. The older couple, Arthur and Cynthia, stared at us in total bewildered silence, completely unable to comprehend the sudden, terrifying shift in the dynamic of their dinner party. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell, and I did not display a single ounce of the burning fury that had consumed me during the flight. I maintained a posture of lethal, absolute calm. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my jacket with my free hand. I slowly withdrew the thick, folded legal document that Martin Gallagher had drafted just hours ago. It was the emergency ex parte custody order carrying the official seal of the family court and the undeniable signature of the presiding judge. I held the heavy paper out over the table, letting it hover directly above the remnants of Derek's incredibly expensive meal. I released my grip. The document dropped with a soft, definitive thud, landing squarely on top of his pristine white china plate. Signed by a judge this morning, I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the table with the precision of a surgical blade. Maya is permanently in my legal and physical custody. Derek stared down at the legal document resting on his plate, his eyes wide and unblinking. His chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths. "Dad," he finally managed to stammer, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. "Dad, what are you doing here? How did you find us? What is the meaning of this paper? We can explain everything to you. It is a massive misunderstanding." Stephanie was actively hyperventilating, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. "Robert, please," she gasped, tears of pure panic welling in her eyes. "You have to listen to us. We had a plan. We were going to fix everything when we got back." I completely ignored their pathetic, desperate pleas. I shifted my attention away from the monsters I was related to and turned my gaze toward the wealthy older couple sitting across the booth. Arthur and Cynthia were staring at me, their faces painted with extreme shock and confusion. I offered them a polite, perfectly composed nod, maintaining the polished demeanor of a man who was entirely in control of his environment. "My sincere apologies for the sudden interruption to your evening," I said to them, my tone shifting to a smooth, courteous cadence. "But my son conveniently forgot to mention a crucial detail regarding his financial situation during your delightful conversation. He forgot to inform you that he funded this entire luxury vacation, including this extravagant dinner, by deliberately embezzling the sacred medical trust fund of his traumatized, disabled daughter. Arthur let out a sharp, audible gasp, his eyes darting from my face to the terrified expressions of Derek and Stephanie. Cynthia brought a trembling hand up to cover her mouth, staring at Maya with profound, heartbroken horror. They instantly recognized the absolute truth in my words. The charming, wealthy couple they had been dining with were suddenly revealed to be nothing more than ruthless, calculating predators. Arthur and Cynthia simultaneously pushed their heavy chairs back, physically recoiling from the table, as if Derek and Stephanie were carrying a highly contagious, lethal disease. I turned my attention back to my son, letting the full weight of my judgment bear down upon his trembling shoulders. The financial trap I had meticulously prepared was now fully engaged, and the walls were rapidly closing in on his fabricated kingdom. I froze the trust accounts completely yesterday morning. I informed him, my voice devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. Every single one of your secondary access cards is now nothing more than useless plastic garbage. The fraud department at the central bank has completely audited your forged medical invoices, and they have already alerted the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding the massive wire fraud you committed to pay for this cruise. Derek let out a choked, desperate sound, his hands frantically searching his pockets for his smartphone. "Dad, you cannot do this," he pleaded, his eyes darting around the restaurant as he realized the inescapable nature of his reality. "You are going to ruin my entire life. You are going to send me to a federal prison. I am your son. You have to stop this immediately." Right on cue, as if the universe itself had perfectly timed the execution of my vengeance, a tall man wearing a crisp, authoritative maritime uniform approached the table. He was the senior hospitality manager of the cruise liner, accompanied by two large, broad-shouldered security officers dressed in dark suits. The manager held a black leather billfold in his hands, his expression remarkably grim and entirely uncompromising. He stopped directly beside Derek, looking down at the ruined, panicked man. "Mr. Caldwell," the manager said, his voice loud enough to be heard by the surrounding tables. "I sincerely apologize for this public intrusion, but we have a critical and immediate situation regarding your accounts. The primary credit card you placed on file to secure your VIP suite, as well as this evening's $8,000 dining and beverage tab, has just been permanently declined by your banking institution." Derek stared at the manager, his face twitching with sheer disbelief. "Declined? That is impossible. Try it again. Run the numbers again. There has to be a simple routing error with the servers." "There is no routing error, sir," the manager continued, his tone becoming significantly more rigid and less accommodating. "Furthermore, our financial division just received an urgent direct communication from your bank. They have officially flagged your entire account portfolio for severe systemic fraud. We are required by international maritime law to immediately suspend all of your passenger privileges. I must ask you and your wife to settle this outstanding balance through an alternative verifiable payment method right this second, or I will have no choice but to have security escort you directly to the holding quarters on the lower decks, pending our arrival at the next port of call." Total, uncontrollable panic instantly erupted at the table. Stephanie burst into loud, hysterical sobs, covering her face with her trembling hands, realizing that her pristine, curated life was officially over. She was no longer a wealthy influencer celebrating a new pregnancy. She was a documented criminal facing immediate detention. Derek began arguing frantically with the hospitality manager, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to negotiate a delay, begging for internet access, pleading for an opportunity to call his bank and resolve the catastrophic freeze on his assets. But there was absolutely no resolution available to him. The legal and financial guillotine had fallen perfectly, severing his access to the stolen wealth and exposing his true monstrous nature to the entire world. I stood there for one final moment, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had viewed Maya as a disposable object. The freezing clarity inside my mind told me that my work here was completely finished. I had kept my promise to Eleanor, and I had fulfilled my promise to the little girl resting safely in my arms. I held Maya securely against my chest, ensuring she was completely insulated from the chaotic, desperate shouting of the man who used to be my son. I turned my back on the magnificent table, on the shattered crystal, and on the ruins of their miserable lives. I walked away from the darkness, carrying my granddaughter toward the light, ready to take her back to a home where she would never be considered broken again. Derek scrambled wildly out of his heavy leather chair, his expensive Italian shoes slipping awkwardly against the polished mahogany floorboards. "Wait, Dad, you cannot just leave us here like this." His voice had lost all of its smooth, arrogant timbre. It was now a high, pathetic whine that echoed off the frosted glass walls of the premium steakhouse. "Think about my professional reputation back in Seattle, Dad. Think about the consulting firm and our prestigious clients. Think about the innocent baby Stephanie is currently carrying. You are going to make your own biological grandson grow up in absolute poverty because of some ridiculous misunderstanding over an adoption that was not even working out." I did not stop walking. I did not even slow my deliberate, measured pace. I kept my eyes focused firmly on the illuminated exit, navigating the complicated labyrinth of white tablecloths and thoroughly stunned diners. Derek rushed forward desperately, attempting to grab the sleeve of my dark winter coat, but the two large security officers instantly stepped into his narrow path, physically blocking his advance with their broad, imposing shoulders. "Sir, I need you to remain seated at this table until the local port authorities arrive to formally process the international fraud complaint," the maritime manager stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising wall of absolute authority. Stephanie let out another piercing, hysterical wail, her perfectly manicured hands clawing desperately at the expensive silk fabric of her designer evening gown. She finally realized the horrifying, inescapable truth of their immediate situation. They were completely stranded in Nassau, entirely devoid of usable funds, officially stripped of their passenger privileges, and awaiting immediate criminal detention. Their meticulously curated social media empire, their stolen luxury vehicles, and their entire fraudulent existence had been permanently incinerated in a matter of 5 devastating minutes. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out onto the vibrant, bustling promenade of the luxury ship. The cheerful, upbeat music from the live band still echoed loudly through the central atrium, creating a bizarre, surreal contrast to the absolute personal devastation I had just orchestrated. Maya shifted her fragile weight in my arms, wrapping her small, trembling fingers tightly into the warm lapel of my cotton shirt. She buried her face deeply into the crook of my neck, seeking desperate refuge from the overwhelming noise and the bright, flashing neon lights. I held her incredibly close, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of her breathing against my collarbone as we moved away from the chaos. "Are they coming with us, Grandpa?" She whispered, her soft voice barely audible over the chaotic, joyful din of the surrounding vacationing crowds. "No, sweetheart." I answered, my tone softening into a deep, comforting, reassuring murmur just for her. "They are staying right here. They have a very long, very difficult journey ahead of them, and it is a journey they have to take completely alone. You and I are going directly back to the airport. We are going back home." We made our way down to the lower decks, entirely bypassing the massive winding lines of excited passengers waiting to enter the evening theatrical shows. The stern purser at the security desk meticulously reviewed my emergency exit authorization and silently unlatched the heavy metal gate leading to the exterior gangway. The sudden physical transition from the artificial, aggressively air-conditioned luxury of the ship back out into the thick, humid night air of the Bahamas felt like finally waking up from a long, suffocating fever dream. I walked slowly down the steep metallic ramp of the gangway, my heavy footsteps ringing out with a hollow, rhythmic echo against the steel grates. Far below us, the dark, turbulent waters of the deep harbor lapped rhythmically against the massive white-painted hull of the towering cruise liner. I paused for a single defining moment halfway down the long ramp, turning my head to look back up at the brightly illuminated structure. Somewhere up there, completely trapped in a gilded, expensive cage of their own making, My son and his wife were finally experiencing the terrifying, inescapable reality of absolute consequence. I felt absolutely no lingering sorrow for Derek. The young boy I had lovingly raised had effectively died the very moment he placed a heavy steel padlock on this innocent little girl's bedroom door. The broken man remaining was a total stranger, a ruthless predator who was currently facing the exact measure of severe justice he so richly deserved. I safely reached the bottom of the ramp and stepped onto the solid, unyielding concrete surface of the port terminal. A waiting black town car idled quietly by the curb, its bright headlights cutting sharply through the dense tropical darkness of the island night. I gently placed Maya into the spacious back seat, carefully securing her leather safety belt, before smoothly sliding in beside her. The professional driver closed the heavy door securely, sealing us inside the quiet, leather-scented sanctuary of the vehicle cabin. As the powerful car smoothly pulled away from the busy port, I looked down at the precious child, resting her weary head against my arm. She was already drifting off to a deep sleep, her small chest rising and falling with a peaceful, completely undisturbed, beautiful regularity. I rested my hand over hers, the solid gold of my wedding band, catching the soft, fleeting glow of the passing island streetlights. Eleanor had been absolutely right all those wonderful years ago on our back porch. We have a profound moral obligation to be the ones who offer safety. The complicated legal battles ahead would be fierce and exhausting. But looking at her sleeping face, I knew with absolute certainty that every single upcoming battle was entirely worth fighting. Family is not defined by blood, but by who you protect. I lost a greedy son today, but I gained a granddaughter who deserves the world. And this time no one will ever leave her in the dark again.